Before time was divided into seconds, minutes, and hours, it existed only as an experience. There were no ticking mechanisms, no glowing screens, and no alarms interrupting the quiet of the night. Time was not something people checked. It was something they felt. In the earliest human societies, time was inseparable from nature. The rising and setting of the sun shaped the rhythm of life. Day meant warmth, movement, and activity. Night meant darkness, rest, and caution. This simple cycle formed the first and most universal understanding of time. Long before words or symbols were created to describe it, early humans did not ask what time it was. Instead, they asked different questions. Is the sun high or low? Has the cold begun to fade? Are the shadows long or short? These observations were enough. They told hunters when to leave and when to return. They told families when to gather and when to sleep. Time was not measured. It was lived. As human awareness grew, patterns began to emerge. People noticed that days repeated themselves, but they were not identical. Some days were longer, others shorter. Some brought warmth, others cold. Slowly, humans realized that time moved in larger cycles beyond day and night. The seasons arrived, passed, and returned. Animals migrated. Plants grew, bloomed, and withered. These recurring patterns became the first long-term markers of time. The sky played a central role in this understanding. The sun was the most powerful symbol of time's passage. Its steady journey across the sky gave structure to the day. Dawn marked beginnings. Midday marked fullness. Dusk marked endings. Even without tools or language, the sun silently taught humans how to divide their days. The moon offered another lesson. Unlike the sun, the moon changed its shape. It grew thin, then full, then thin again. This cycle fascinated early observers. Over time, they realized that the moon's changes followed a regular pattern. Roughly every month, the moon returned. Long before humans built tools to measure time, the sun quietly performed that role on its own. Each day, it rose in the east, traveled across the sky, and disappeared in the west. This steady movement became humanity's earliest and most reliable way of understanding the passage of time. At first, the sun simply divided life into light and darkness. But over generations, people began to notice details. The sun did not rise in the same place every day. Its path across the sky changed slowly throughout the year. Some days felt longer, others shorter. These subtle changes revealed that time was not only daily, but seasonal. Shadows were among the first indicators of time within a single day. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shortened. As it sank lower, shadows stretched across the ground. Early humans noticed that shadows moved predictably. A tree, a rock, or a standing person could become a reference point. Without realizing it, people were already reading the sun like a clock face. In open landscapes, this observation became especially useful. Hunters learned how far they could travel before nightfall by watching the sun's position. Farmers learned when the day was halfway done. Communities learned when it was time to return home. The sun offered guidance without words or instruments. As settlements formed, people began using fixed objects to observe the sun more precisely. Stones were placed upright. Poles were driven into the ground. Walls cast shadows that shifted slowly throughout the day. By watching how these shadows moved, people could roughly divide the day into parts. These divisions were not exact. There were no hours or minutes. Instead, time was described in simple terms. Early morning, high sun, late afternoon, These moments were understood collectively, even without formal agreement. Everyone knew what they meant because everyone watched the same sky. Over time, certain shadow positions became meaningful. When a shadow reached a particular stone, as human understanding of the sun deepened, attention slowly shifted from the sun itself to the shadows it created. Shadows moved silently across the ground, stretching and shrinking in response to the sun's position. Unlike the sun, which could be difficult to observe directly, shadows offered a gentle and accessible way to read time. Early humans noticed that shadows followed predictable paths. At sunrise, shadows were long and pointed westward. As the sun climbed higher, they shortened and rotated. By midday, shadows became their shortest. As evening approached, they lengthened again, pointing eastward. This daily motion repeated itself with remarkable consistency. Over time, people began to associate specific moments of the day with certain shadow positions. These associations did not require tools or markings. They relied on familiarity. A shadow touching a rock, a shadow aligning with a doorway, a shadow reaching the edge of a clearing. These moments became natural time signals. In open fields and villages, shared landmarks helped synchronize daily life. A tall tree, a standing stone, or the corner of a building could serve as a reference point. When the shadow reached a known position, it was understood that a certain part of the day had arrived. Work shifted, meals were prepared, gatherings began. This informal system of timekeeping required cooperation and shared experience. Everyone needed to agree, even silently, on what certain shadow movements meant. This created a collective sense of time. Though unspoken, it was widely understood. As communities became more settled, shadow observation grew more intentional. Upright poles were placed in central locations. These poles cast shadows that moved in clear arcs throughout the day. By watching these movements repeatedly, people learned to anticipate time rather than simply react to it. The concept of midday became especially important. Midday was when the sun stood highest and shadows were shortest. While the sun shaped the rhythm of each day, the moon quietly introduced a longer measure of time. Unlike the sun, which appeared the same from one day to the next, the moon changed its shape. Night after night it grew, faded, disappeared, and returned. These changes captured human attention very early in history. At first, the moon cycle was simply observed. A thin curve appeared in the evening sky. Each night it grew brighter and fuller. Then, after reaching its fullest form, it began to shrink. Eventually, it vanished entirely, leaving the night sky dark. After a short time, it returned once more. This pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. Early humans noticed that the moon completed its cycle in roughly the same amount of time each round. This became one of the first reliable long-term measurements of time. It was longer than a day, but shorter than a season. It filled a gap in human understanding. Over time, people began to count days by the moon. The period from one full moon to the next became meaningful. It marked a natural unit of time, later known as a month. Though the word itself came much later, the concept existed long before language formalized it. The moon cycle became especially useful at night when the sun was absent. Its brightness influenced human activity. On full moon nights, people could see more clearly. Travel was easier, gatherings lasted longer. On darker nights, people stayed closer to home. Because of this, the moon naturally became associated with planning. Certain tasks were better performed under moonlight. Others were avoided during darker phases. Time was no longer only about observation, but about anticipation. In many early cultures, the moon gained symbolic importance. It was seen as a guide, a protector, or a watcher in the night sky. Its dependable return offered comfort and predictability in a world full of uncertainty. The moon also helped track longer cycles. People noticed that certain natural ebb. Beyond the daily movement of the sun and the monthly cycle of the moon, early humans became aware of a much slower rhythm. This rhythm unfolded across the year, shaping the world in gradual but powerful ways. It was the cycle of the seasons. Unlike the sun or moon, the seasons did not announce themselves clearly. They arrived slowly, temperature shifted, the length of days changed. Plants behaved differently. Animals moved, shed, or migrated. Over time, people learned to recognize these patterns and understand them as markers of long-term time. Spring was noticed first through subtle signs. Snow melted, rivers flowed more freely, new growth appeared on plants that had been bare, animals returned or gave birth. These changes signaled renewal. It was a time for beginning. Summer followed with warmth and abundance. Days grew longer. Food became more available. Work increased, but so did energy. The sun's path stayed high, and nights were short. This was a season of activity and preparation. Autumn brought change once again. Leaves fell, air cooled, harvests were gathered, animals stored food or moved on. The days shortened, and shadows grew longer. This was a time of completion and readiness. Winter arrived quietly but firmly. Cold settled in, growth slowed, darkness lingered. Survival required planning, cooperation, and patience. Time during winter felt slower. Days were measured not by productivity, but by endurance. These seasonal patterns repeated year after year. Early humans did not know why they occurred, but they trusted their consistency. Seasons became the largest natural unit of time. A life was measured in winters survived. A child's age could be counted in harvests. Unlike daily or monthly time, seasons could not be observed in a single glance. They required memory. People compared the present to the past. This year's winter felt harsher. This spring arrived earlier. These comparisons deepened human awareness of time's passage. Seasonal timekeeping. Before written numbers and formal calendars, humans still found ways to count time. These methods were simple, physical, and deeply tied to memory. Time was counted not with symbols, but with actions, marks, and repetition. One of the earliest ways to count days was through physical marking. People scratched lines into wood, bone, or stone. Each mark represented a day that had passed. When the moon completed its cycle, the marks would end and the process would begin again. These markings were not standardized. Each community developed its own system. Some counted days between full moons. Others counted nights instead of days. What mattered was consistency, not precision. In some cultures, knots were tied in cords or fibers. Each knot marked the passing of a day or a significant event. When the cord was filled, a cycle was complete. This method allowed time to be carried, remembered, and shared. Memory also played a central role. Stories acted as timekeeping tools. Events were placed in relation to one another. This happened after the Great Flood. That occurred 3 winters ago. Time was embedded in narrative rather than numbers. Repetition reinforced memory. Daily routines created an internal clock. People knew how long something took because they had done it many times before. Time was learned through experience. Communal life strengthened these methods. When people lived closely together, timekeeping became shared. Everyone knew when a cycle ended or began. Social agreement replaced measurement. In agricultural communities, counting days helped track planting and harvesting. Though imprecise, it was effective enough. Crops grew according to natural rhythms, not exact dates. Errors were accepted. If counting was off by a day or two, nature corrected the mistake. Early timekeeping was flexible. It adapted rather than enforced. These early methods reveal an important truth. Humans did not need perfect accuracy to live meaningful lives. They needed rhythm. As humans became more observant of their surroundings, time was no longer measured only by the sky. It was also read in the land, in animals, and in the human body itself. Nature became a living clock, constantly offering quiet signals of passing time. Plants were among the clearest indicators. People noticed when certain flowers bloomed and when leaves changed color. These events happened at roughly the same time each year. Over generations, they became trusted markers of seasonal time. Animals also followed predictable rhythms. Birds migrated, herds moved, insects appeared and disappeared. These patterns were observed and remembered. When a certain animal returned, people knew a season had begun. When it left, another was ending. Even the human body reflected time's passage. Fatigue followed long days. Hunger returned at familiar intervals. Sleep came naturally with darkness. Without artificial light, people's internal rhythms aligned closely with the natural world. Age itself became a measure of time. Children grew, elders aged. Physical change made time visible. Life stages replaced numbered years. Someone was considered young, mature, or old based on experience rather than age. Natural events also marked important moments. Floods, droughts, and storms became reference points in collective memory. Time was remembered in relation to these events rather than abstract dates. In this way, time became deeply personal. It was felt through change, growth, and repetition. It was not something distant or mechanical. It lived in everyday experience. This approach to time created a strong connection between people and their environment. Observing nature was essential. Ignoring it meant losing track of time itself. Though imprecise, this method fostered patience and respect. Time moved at its own pace, and humans learned to move with it rather than against it. Nature-based timekeeping lasted for thousands of years and still influences how people experience time too. As human societies grew larger and more organized, the need to track longer periods of time became more important. Memory and observation were no longer enough on their own. People began creating the first calendars, not as tools of precision, but as aids to remembrance. These early calendars were simple. They were not books or charts, but physical objects. Stones were arranged in circles. Lines were carved into cave walls. Notches were cut into bones or pieces of wood. Each mark represented a passing day, a moon, or a season. Many of these early calendars were based on the moon. A sequence of marks would track the moon's phases. When the moon completed its cycle, the count began again. This system helped communities remember when to prepare for recurring events. Some calendars were tied directly to the sun. Stones or structures were aligned so that sunlight fell on specific points during certain times of the year. These alignments marked seasonal transitions rather than exact dates. These calendars were not meant to be consulted daily. They were consulted occasionally, often during important moments, a planting season, a harvest, a ritual. Time was still experienced naturally, with calendars serving as gentle guides rather than strict rulers. Different regions developed different systems. In some places, calendars followed the rhythm of rain. In others, they followed temperature or animal movement. Timekeeping adapted to local environments. Because there was no single standard, calendars varied widely. What mattered was usefulness, not uniformity. A calendar only needed to work for the people who used it. The creation of calendars marked an important shift. Time was no longer entirely internal or observational. It could now be recorded and preserved. Future generations could learn from past cycles. Despite this advancement, calendars remained flexible. Adjustments were made when observations did not align perfectly. Nature was still the final authority. Before time was written down in numbers, it lived in memory. Stories became one of the most powerful ways humans understood and preserved the passage of time. Events were remembered not by dates but by meaning. A story did not begin with a year or a day. It began with an event. The great journey, the long winter, the season of abundance. These moments became anchors in collective memory. Everything else was arranged around them. When people spoke of the past, they described it in relation to other experiences. Something happened before the great storm. Something else followed the arrival of new lands. Time was relational rather than fixed. Elders played a vital role in this system. They carried memory across generations. By telling stories, they preserved knowledge of how long things lasted and when certain changes occurred. Time was passed from voice to voice. Stories also taught rhythm. Repeated narratives reinforced the sense of cycles. Birth, growth, loss, and renewal appeared again and again. Through these patterns, people learned to expect change. This way of understanding time was deeply human. It connected emotion, memory, and meaning. Time was not separate from life. It was woven into it. Though imprecise, story-based timekeeping was resilient. It survived change, movement, and loss. As long as stories were told, time was remembered. Even today, traces of this remain. People still remember life in chapters, not timestamps. This reminds us how deeply rooted this ancient sense of time still is. As human understanding of time deepened, it began to take on a meaning beyond survival and routine. Time became sacred. Certain moments were no longer ordinary. They were set apart, honored, and remembered with care. These sacred moments were often tied to natural cycles. The longest day of the year, the longest night, the first signs of spring, the final harvest before winter. These transitions felt powerful, almost mysterious, and people marked them with intention. Ceremonies emerged as a way to recognize these moments. Gatherings were held, fires were lit, songs were sung. These acts did not measure time, but they gave it meaning. They turned time into something shared and remembered. In many cultures, time was believed to flow in circles rather than lines. What had happened before would happen again. Seasons returned. Life repeated itself. This belief shaped how people prepared for the future. They did not expect constant progress, but reliable return. Sacred time stood apart from everyday time. Work paused. normal routines stopped. These moments allowed reflection and renewal. Time was not only passing, it was being honored. Stories of creation and origin were often linked to time. The beginning of the world marked the beginning of time itself. From that point forward, all cycles followed. Time became part of a larger cosmic order. Rituals helped preserve this order. Performing them at the right moment was believed to maintain balance. Timekeeping was no longer just practical. It was spiritual. Though these beliefs varied widely, they shared a common idea. Time mattered. It was not endless or meaningless. Each moment had a place within a greater rhythm. This sacred view of time influenced early calendars and traditions for generations. Even without clocks, people knew what a moment was important. By giving time meaning, humans deepened their connection to it. Time was no longer only observed, it was respected. As societies grew more complex, the flexible and natural ways of understanding time were no longer always sufficient. Trade expanded. Agriculture became more structured. Ceremonies required consistency. Slowly, humans began seeking greater precision in how time was measured. This did not happen suddenly. It began with small refinements to existing methods. Shadows were observed more carefully. Poles were placed more deliberately. Markings were added to indicate recurring positions. Time was still guided by nature, but with increasing attention to detail. Communities started identifying specific moments within the day that needed consistency. Certain activities worked best when performed at the same time each day. This encouraged closer observation and comparison. The idea of dividing the day into smaller parts began to take shape. These divisions were not equal everywhere. They changed with the seasons. Still, the concept itself was important. Time was becoming segmented. This period marked a transition. Time was no longer only followed, it was studied. Humans began asking not just when, but how long. Though still far from modern clocks, these early efforts reflected a growing desire to understand time more deeply. Precision was emerging, not from technology, but from careful observation and repetition. This shift laid the groundwork for future inventions. It showed that time could be measured more carefully without losing its connection to nature. As human societies expanded beyond small groups, timekeeping became a shared responsibility. It was no longer enough for individuals to understand time on their own. Communities needed common reference points so people could act together. Markets, gatherings, and ceremonies required coordination. People needed to arrive at the same moment, begin tasks together, and prepare in advance. This pushed time from personal experience into collective agreement. Certain individuals became trusted observers. They watched the sky, tracked cycles, and announced important moments. These observers did not control time, but they helped interpret it for others. Public spaces played a role as well. Central locations allowed time signals to be shared. When the sun reached a known position or a shadow touched a specific mark, everyone understood its meaning. Time became part of social order. It influenced when work began, when rest was allowed, and when rituals occurred. Though still flexible, time was becoming structured. This shared understanding strengthened cooperation. People could plan together and depend on one another. Time was no longer private, it was communal. Even without clocks, societies learned to move together through time. As observation deepened, humans slowly realized that time was not only shaped by what happened on Earth, but by the movement of the sky itself. The heavens became a vast and reliable reference, offering patterns that extended far beyond a single lifetime. Stars were among the first new guides. Unlike the sun and moon, stars appeared fixed in relation to one another. Night after night, they returned to the same positions, rotating slowly across the sky. This consistency made them powerful markers of time. People noticed that certain stars appeared at specific times of the year. Some rose just before dawn. Others dominated the night sky during particular seasons. Their arrival and disappearance became signals of seasonal change. Over many generations, this knowledge accumulated. The sky became a map, not of places, but of time. By recognizing familiar star patterns, people could tell whether the year was advancing or returning. Constellations emerged from this process. Humans grouped stars into recognizable shapes, often tied to stories or animals. These stories made the sky easier to remember. Each constellation became a signpost in time. This celestial awareness allowed time to be tracked even when the sun was absent. During long nights or overcast days, the stars offered reassurance. Time was still moving, still knowable. In some cultures, the stars were seen as eternal, unchanging witnesses. While human lives passed quickly, the sky remained. This contrast deepened reflection on time and mortality. Watching the sky required patience. Star movements were slow. Changes happened across months and years. This encouraged long-term thinking and careful memory. By trusting the heavens, humans expanded their sense of time beyond the immediate world. Time was no longer only local. It was cosmic. This understanding prepared humanity for more advanced systems of timekeeping, rooted not just in Earth, but in the universe itself. For most of human history, time did not belong to anyone. It was not something that could be bought, sold, saved, or wasted. It simply existed, moving quietly alongside life. Without clocks, there was no constant reminder of passing moments. People were guided by readiness rather than schedules. Work began when conditions were right. Rest came when bodies grew tired. Time adjusted to life, not the other way around. This created a different relationship with time. There was less urgency. Moments were not measured against productivity or efficiency. A task took as long as it needed to take. Waiting was natural. Delays were expected. Nature set the pace, and people adapted. Time was generous, not scarce. This way of living encouraged presence. Attention remained on what was happening now, rather than what came next. The future was anticipated but not controlled. Though this freedom had limits, it shaped a worldview where time was shared equally. No one could demand more of it than another. Everyone lived under the same sky, guided by the same cycles. This relationship with time began to change only when precision and ownership emerged. But before that shift, time was a companion, not a master. Understanding this ancient relationship helps us remember that time was once experienced gently, without constant measurement. Gradually, humanity reached a turning point. Observation and tradition were no longer enough for the growing complexity of life. Cities expanded. Trade networks stretched across great distances. Agreements required consistency. This need did not erase older ways of understanding time. Instead, it built upon them. The sun, moon, seasons, and stars still mattered. But now, people sought tools that could divide time more finely. The idea of the hour emerged from this desire. It was not born from machines, but from observation. The day was divided into parts: based on light and shadow. Though these divisions changed with the seasons, they introduced a new way of thinking. Time slowly became something that could be counted rather than only observed. This shift altered human behavior. Activities were organized more strictly. Expectations became clearer. Life became more structured. Yet even as precision grew, the ancient rhythms remained beneath the surface. Days still began with sunrise. Nights still invited rest. Seasons still shaped life in powerful ways. The invention of clocks would later transform time completely. But before that moment, humanity lived for thousands of years, guided by nature's quiet signals. Remembering this history reminds us that time was once experienced as flow rather than pressure. It was something we moved through together rather than something that chased us. Even now, beneath numbers and schedules, those ancient rhythms remain. The sun still rises. The moon still changes. Seasons still return. Time has always been with us, long before we tried to measure it.